Our next speaker is Jamie Paris. Jamie is an assistant professor of English at Corpus Christi College, St. Mark's College at the University of British Columbia. Paris's work is focused on intersectionality with a specific interest in whiteness studies and pre-modern critical race studies. He has forthcoming work on whiteness in William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice with the Journal of Early Modern Culture, and whiteness in Thomas Middleton's and Rowley's The Changeling. Paris is also putting together a manuscript tentatively titled Clothed Villainy, which is contracted with the University of Alabama Press as part of the Strode series. This manuscript is interested in the performative nature of whiteness and role of racial cross-dressing on the modern stage. In the fall, Paris will begin a new position as an instructor at the University of Manitoba in the Department of English, Theatre, and Film. Congratulations, Jamie.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Jamie Paris. I'm an assistant professor at Corpus Christi University, and here's my talk on early modern English Black Christianity and Middleton's The Triumphs of Truth. Well, I'm happy to be here virtually today. I must confess my reservations about participating on Congress this year. As many of you will know, the Black Canadian Studies Association has withdrawn from this year's Congress, partly in response to an instance of anti-Black racial profiling at the Congress 2019 in Vancouver. The BCS lobbied Congress to implement changes to address structural racism, and, in all fairness, Congress has taken some meaningful strides. They have reduced the cost for graduate students and community members for self-identified Black and Indigenous scholars. They are inviting more BIPOC scholars to give big thinking talks. They have created an advisory committee on equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. While these steps are important, there's more work to be done if we want Congress to be a safe and welcoming space that treats everyone with dignity and respect. Some scholarly associations, like the Association of Canadian College and University Teachers of English, have issued strong statements of support for the BSCA. Others, like the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, have withdrawn from Congress this year. The Canadian Society for Renaissance Studies, in contrast, has been relatively silent. I'm deeply concerned about this message, about what message that silence sends to emerging BIPOC scholars in the field. That's my reservations about giving this talk. I decided, however, to give the talk because I think that this year, of all years, it's important for us to talk about the history of anti-Blackness. And I've always found the CRSC an inviting space for working on pre-modern critical race theory. So let's get to it. The Triumph of Truth is Middleton's first of 7 Lord Mayoral shows. It was presented in honor of the election of Thomas Middleton as Mayor of London in 1613. The two Thomas Middletons are not related, although this has been a perpetual source of confusion for students and the occasional scholar. Arguably, the Triumph of Truth was the most expensive and most spectacular Jacobean Lord Mayoral show. The Grocers' Guild last elected a mayor in 1598, and they were determined to spend whatever was necessary to make a theatrical splash. The play itself is a sustained moral allegory that relies on themes and symbol rather than plot to show how truth can prevail over error. Mayoral shows were prolific. Thus, no member of the audience was likely to see it from start to finish. Rather, each set would have a particular scene or tableau, not unlike a medieval morality play or pageant, and the argument of the play would only become clear to most viewers when the mayoral show was published as a book. The characters in the pageant are highly symbolic, and the representation of the different characters owe a lot to the emblem tradition. In that tradition, tropes of Blackness were associated with death and mourning, sin, and evil, and readers were not asked to look past the chromodernal signifier of Blackness in judging the morality of Black characters. In thinking of this play as a foundational document of anti-racist literature, then, I am not saying that it is without any Blackness, any anti-Blackness, as it is not. Gary Taylor argues in his influential reading of the play, Middleton schisms faith from skin color, since what matters to him is not skin color, but the boundary that separates Christian from non-Christian. Thus, for Taylor, Part of what makes the play important is that it shows one of the first unambiguously positive representations of a black man on the early modern stage. Taylor's reading gets close to being a paraphrase of Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous request to judge his daughters, quote, not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. This should not be taken to mean that Middleton is colorblind. The blackness of the king is essential for understanding Middleton's larger point about how prejudgments can make us avoid the wise counsel of others. In drawing attention to the likely whiteness of the London audience, I'm not bringing race into the discussion so much as I'm paraphrasing the words of the Black King. Middleton's pageant may have the first use of the phrase white people in English literature. The line is spoken by the King of the Moors, who says that he sees, quote, amazement set upon the faces of these white people, wondering and staring gazes. The appearance of the King of the Moors ought not to be a cause for amazement in and of itself. As Ania Lumba notes, visual entertainments and pageants have repeatedly featured an enormous variety of racial outsiders as well as personifications of lands with which there was real or desired trade. A black king praising white London merchants was a staple of mayoral pageants because it was an effective bit of propaganda. As Anthony Bartlemy argues in Blackface Maligned Race, early modern mayoral pageants were primarily works of racist propaganda designed to spiritually justify the economics of colonialism and prop up support for expanded trade with both the East and West Indies that was producing new wealth for noblemen and guildsmen alike, very people paying for this play. For Middleton, the major rationale for England's colonial enterprises is the conversion of religious others to the Christian faith. Thus, Virginia Mason Vaughn argues in Performing Blackness that Middleton's pageant demonstrates how the black-faced devils of the homiletic tradition have become amalgamated with the figure of the Black Moor of Africa in a conventional symbol of the qualities, barbarism, ignorance, impudence, and falsehood, in opposition to white Englishness and true religion. The battle between the forces of good and evil no longer figured in the next world, but in the here and now of exploration and trade. In this way, while the Black King self-identifies as Christian, he says he was converted to Christianity through the good example of English merchants and traders. His, quote, true Christian faith is represented in the play as an example of the power of trade to convert infidels. Delivering such a message at St. Paul's Cross would have been a valuable bit of propaganda for the grocers, as it could wrap their ideas for colonial goods within a larger moral framework of missionary work that was being debated at St. Paul's Cross at the time. The play uses light and dark imagery to make its arguments, with darkness and blackness being associated with sin and error, and whiteness and light being associated with piety and truth. The character Truth, for example, warns against that elf of sin and darkness. The angel is a creature of light who has expelled from London her black spite. Zeal, moreover, tells the mayor about the dangers of darkness in his thoughts, reminding him that truth needs that crown of stars, shows her descent from heaven, and that noble robe of white filled with eagle's eyes. When error speaks, moreover, the set is overspread with a thick, sulphurous darkness. Finally, error is particularly upset that her sweet-faced devils, the king and his court, have forsaken her, a move that reinforces the connection between blackness, ugliness, and demonism. Thus, while the play associates the King of the Moors with truth and Christianity, it does so in a way that allows its audience to maintain anti-black prejudices by treating him as an exception to the rule. The King of the Moors is an exotic fiction. He's on the side of truth and a self-identifying Christian. But what exactly does it mean in the early modern period to be a black Christian? How does the adjective black modify or mark the collective noun Christian? To what degree were black Christian converts seen as Christian by white onlookers? In phrasing my research question this way, I'm taking inside in an ongoing historical debate about the relationship between Blackness and Christianity in early modern England. According to Miranda Kaufman in Black Tutors, the early moderns were far more likely to judge a new acquaintance by his or her religion and social class than they were by where he was born or the color of their skin, although these categories did on occasion interact. She says that when Africans arrived in England as ambassadors, they were treated as such. But when they arrived aboard a captured ship, they found themselves at the bottom of the pile. I'm fascinated by this idea that black people arrived aboard captured ships. The reference here is likely to English pirates stealing slave ships and bringing the cargo to England. While there was no official slavery in early modern England, and England would not become a major player in the transatlantic slave trade for decades, it's unlikely that these former slaves experienced the same level of freedom as the white people with similar economic skills. For more on this complicated history, see Michael Grasco's Slaves and Englishmen, Human Bondage in the Early Modern Atlantic World, who reminds us that slavery was alive and well in early modern England, even if actual slaves were hard to find, and the debates over the nature of how natural slavery was were central to political and religious debates in the period. In contrast, for Habib in Black Lives in the English Archives, black people in the early modern period were baptized as Christians in parish churches, but often with cryptic citations of Negro, Blackamoor, and Indian. Even the death records of black Christians noted their dual identity as black people and Christian, while no such duality is given for Europeans. Being a black Christian was a marked identity, in the same way that being a white Turk is a marked identity. Being a white Christian is an unmarked identity. If black Christians were merely judged by their religion and occupation, then why are they marked on their baptismal and death records in ways that note that they are ethnically and racially different? It is often unclear, moreover, if black Christians really had a choice in being baptized as Christians, or if baptism was the price of taking up professions as trumpeters, drivers, laundresses, servants, and maids. Many black people in England in the early modern period did not arrive on the island of their own free will. It is unclear if those persons would have been allowed to maintain a religious identity other than a Christian, or at least openly maintain such an identity. What is clear is the state saw the Christianity of Queen Elizabeth's black subjects as conditional. And one of the few legal references to black persons in English law, Queen Elizabeth's Privy Council notes that, in these hard times of dearth, the Queen was highly discontented to understand the great number of Negroes and Blackamoors in her realm. Moreover, the Queen understood them as infidels, having no understanding of Christ or his gospel, and thus wants them deported. Before white Christians used the collective noun or adjective white to refer to persons of European ethnic descent, they used the adjective Christian to define themselves. For example, in Thomas Munn's A Discovery of Trade, he speaks about the value that Christendom in general will gain from fetching the wares of the East Indies. He's particularly concerned, moreover, with protecting the advantage of Christian merchants against the interest of infidels, like the Persians, Moors, and Indians. He saw trade, in other words, as a clash of civilization that was at once racial and religious. For the white audience, the king, his queen, and the two attendants of his color may have been steered to England by truth itself, but that does not mean they will be accepted as Christians. Emblems of the period, like Gregory Whitney's, stress that black could not have been washed off. Often, blackness is evoked in early modern texts to make a point about the impossibility of religious conversion, and such impossibility marks dark skin as unchangeable. Travel writers like George Best, moreover, argued that blackness was a visible sign of a biblical curse that marked black people as lesser in the eyes of God. The play makes an implicit connection between Christianity and whiteness explicit. As Richard Dyer notes, We often see whiteness as the state of not having a race, and thus white people get to take on the incredibly privileged position of being just people. The king, without his race, would just be a Christian king, but he's wise enough to know that his pilgrimage to London, which he represents as a kind of Mecca filled with temples for the practice of true religion, makes her a stranger within a strange land, even if he shares the same religion as the white masses who are now staring at him. To use the language of Dubois, the king has crossed the color line, and he knows that, for the white audience, he is a problem, even if he sees himself as a Christian like them on the side of truth. Christianity, moreover, was already becoming a tool of colonial control in early modern England. As David Bergenton argues, the new mayoral-elect Thomas Middleton was a colonist who contributed financially to several voyages of discovery and exploration, such as that taken by Sir Walter Raleigh to the West Indies, and the exploration of the Americas. Thomas Middleton was a founding member of the East India Company, and he supported the first attempts to colonize North America by the Virginia Company. In this way, it is important to think about how Christianity was used as a tool of colonial control in Virginia by the very people that Thomas Middleton was financing. For example, in a brief and true report of the newfound land of Virginia, Thomas Harriot discusses the actions of white colonizers in the so-called New World. Harriot articulates the New World as a land filled with valuable goods that the English can take and make themselves wealthy without paying the indigenous inhabitants a fair price. Harriot argues that the English have several advantages over the, quote, natural inhabitants of the America, including, quote, discipline, their strange weapons, and their diseases. He sees the indigenous people as a poor people who, quote, want of skill and judgment and knowledge and use of our things, and who esteem our trifles before things of greater value. Moreover, Harriot suggests that the native inhabitants of Virginia should desire our friendship and love, and will have the greater respect for pleasing and obeying us, if they are first taught Christianity. In time, he argues, they may be brought to civility through the embrace of true religion, and potentially into slavery. This is what Middleton is giving us here. This is a king who has been made obedient and desires nothing more than to please a white Christian audience after his willing embrace of true religion. As Kim F. Hall reminds us in her groundbreaking article, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, one of the central goals of trade was encouraging religious conversion and the eradication of religious and cultural differences. To make this case, she cites Samuel Purchas's Pilgrimage, where the narrator fantasizes about uniting the West with the East and the remotest parts of the world being joined in one band of humanity. Well, this sounds lovely and cosmopolitan. For Purchas, the goal was basically to have one world united in one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one body, one spirit, one inheritance, one God and Father, so there may be thus one church truly Catholic, one pastor, and one sheepfold. As Hall notes, his glorified version of the end of English colonization serves to efface the multivariant anxieties over cross-cultural interactions that permeate English fictions of international trade. Trade leads not only to economic transactions, but to cultural transactions as well. And Purchas is reassuring his readers that these cultural exchanges can be one-sided, whereby the English can bring Christianity to the world without fearing that trade will bring with it different religious worldviews, or that merchants might marry women from the New World. In this way, it matters that the king comes to England with his queen. While she doesn't have a line in the play, she is present on set to reassure the audience that this black Christian king will not try to enter into any romantic relationships with white Christian women while he's on his pilgrimage to England. In closing, then, the king is amazing to me because he is an early acknowledgement of what has come to be called respectability politics. And Stay Woke, a people's guide to making all Black lives matter. Candace Watts Smith and Tamara Lopez define respectability politics as an ideology based on the notion that by presenting oneself in the way that is pleasing to members of the dominant group, one will be able to assuage their fears about one and one's group, and as a consequence, racial animus will dissipate. Many of those who are most vocal about respectability politics within the Black community are, unsurprisingly, coming from the church and are influenced by the civil rights movement. Black Lives Matter activist and Canadian abolitionist scholar Robin Menard argues that those of us who care about Black lives need to challenge the widely held dichotomies of who is innocent, guilty, and how this affects our perception of who is undeserving or deserving of state violence protection. It should not be seen as less violent when the police harm Black youth who, in technical terms, are criminals, or as more violent when police harm innocent Black youth with no previous infractions. Middleton is importantly not saying that all Black lives matter. He's not viewing all Black people as deserving of dignity and respect as people. His focus is not on the inherent dignity of all Black people. Rather, he is focused on the respectability of a Black Christian king, and he uses the respectability of a Black Christian king to assuage fears that a white audience may have about Black people and about trade with them. The play was an important movement in the right direction in terms of anti-racism, to be sure, but it's still a deeply racially problematic text. And I say this because my goal, my only real goal in the world, is to live in a world where all Black life matters, and not just the lives of those who are considered particularly valuable or respectable within a Western cultural paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jamie. And hopefully we can talk a little bit more about the statement either in the discussion today or later today. That would be great. Thank you for that.